Great. Well, buenos dias, everybody. I'm sorry I can't give the presentation in Espanol. My book is available in Spanish. I have the links there on the Google Plus page. What I'm going to do here is try and show you some slides. Tell me if this works here. Hold on one second. Okay. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Yes?
Go ahead.
What's that?
It's okay, Nir.
Oh, okay, great. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about how products change habits. I'm going to give you a very quick overview of how my model works, how products change habits, because we know that our technologies can profoundly impact our day-to-day lives. And so what I've done is to look at patterns, and what patterns can we find in all sorts of habit-forming products that we can learn from so that we can improve people's day-to-day lives with the products that we're building. I wrote this book called Hooked, How to Build Habit-Forming Products. As I mentioned, it's available also in Espanol. And I teach a class at the Graduate School of Business at Stanford on this topic as well. There's going to be a lot of material covered in this presentation, and it's going to go by pretty fast. But the idea is to pique your interest and your curiosity so that you can come back and learn more later, because unfortunately we don't have time to go into a lot of depth today. So I'll just give you a high-level overview. What we'll be talking about is habits and how habits change people's day-to-day behaviors. Just so that we're all on the same page about what a habit is. A habit is, very simply put, is a behavior done with little or no conscious thought. It's about 40% of what you do every single day is done purely out of habit. And I believe that we can use habits for good. And there's a lot of companies today who are using this deeper psychology of habits to help people build better lives. And that's, of course, what I want to help you do today. Now, the fundamental pattern that we see repeated in all sorts of products that form these habits is a hook. A hook is an experience designed to connect your user's problem to your solution with enough frequency to form a habit. So by sending people through these four basic parts of a trigger, action, reward, and investment, this is how user behavior is changed and how habits take hold. So every new habit starts out with a trigger. Triggers come in two flavors, external triggers and internal triggers. External triggers are things in our environment that tell us what to do next, that give us information for what to do. So we all know this in the design community when we're designing a user experience, things that tell the user what to do next, like buy now and click here and play this. All of these things are external triggers. They tell the user what to do next with explicit information. But what turns out to be absolutely critical when it comes to forming long-term habits are these internal triggers. Internal triggers are things that tell the user what to do next by creating an association in the user's mind. So what we do in response to being in a certain situation or place or routine or around certain people or when we experience certain emotions dictates what we do next. And so it's absolutely critical to figure out what is the internal trigger that you're attaching to. And it turns out the most frequent internal trigger are these emotions. But not just any emotion, negative emotions. So what we do in response to being lonesome or bored or fearful or lost or lonely, what we do in response to these emotions dictates what we do next with little or no conscious thought. It dictates the habits that we have with the products we use. Now, some of the research that shows this is the case comes to us from a study that found that people suffering from depression check email more. Now, let's think about why this is. Why would people with depression check email more? Well, it turns out that people suffering from depression experience what psychologists call negative valence states more frequently than the general population. And so what are they doing to boost their mood, to get out of that negative valence state, this uncomfortable emotion? They're using their technologies. And of course, we do this ourselves. When we're feeling lonely, what website do we go to? Well, for many people, it's Facebook. And when we're unsure about something, where do we go when we're unsure? Well, most of us, before we even ask ourselves if we know the answer, we Google it. And then where do we go when we're bored? You know, between 2 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you know, it's a great time to take a siesta, but you're at work, so you can't. So what do we do instead? We go to YouTube. We check stock prices and sports scores and the news, soccer, right? We do all kinds of things to distract ourselves from this internal trigger of boredom. We don't like this feeling of boredom. So what do we do with this? How do we build better products knowing this information about the importance of internal triggers? Well, it comes down to understanding your user's itch. It's very hard to build a habit-forming product without understanding what solution you're building for. What's the itch that you're going to help your user scratch? It's absolutely critical that you understand that. That's a very brief discussion of triggers, but let's move on here for the sake of time to the action phase. The action phase is all about the simplest behavior that's done in anticipation of a reward. The simplest behavior done in anticipation of reward. Let me show you some habit-forming products, and I want to show you how simple some of these actions are. Something as simple as scrolling on Pinterest, or searching on Google, or something as easy as pushing the play button on YouTube. These very simple behaviors done in anticipation of a reward. And it turns out that there's actually a formula to help predict the likelihood of any human behavior occurring. Now think about how powerful this is. Any human behavior can be predicted by this simple formula. This formula comes to us from a professor at Stanford by the name of B.J. Fogg, who posits that for any human behavior we need 3 fundamental things. We need sufficient motivation, sufficient ability. Ability is how easy or difficult something is, and a trigger must be present. We just talked about triggers. So motivation, let's talk about these 3 basic elements. Motivation is the energy for action, how much we want to do a particular behavior. And here there are these 6 factors that Fogg tells us make it more likely for someone to do a behavior by increasing the energy for action, because all of us seek pleasure and avoid pain. We seek hope and we avoid fear. We seek social acceptance and we avoid social rejection. So every bit of ad copy you've ever seen, every word on the marketing web page, or any billboard you might see, all use one of these 6 levers of motivation to get people to have more energy to do a particular behavior. The second part of B equals MAT is ability. It's the capacity to do a particular action, how easy or difficult something is to do. And here again, for any human behavior, something becomes more or less likely to do based on how much time something takes, how much money is involved, how much physical effort something might take. Brain cycles. Brain cycles says that something becomes more likely to occur when it is easier to understand. So this is really important when it comes to technology products, that if we can make something easier to understand, it's more likely that the behavior will occur. Social deviance says that we become more likely to do something when we see other people like us doing it. And then finally, non-routine says that we become more likely to do something simply for the fact that we have done it before in the past. So when we craft our interfaces, when we're designing an experience for our users, the fact that something is familiar, that something is not too novel, makes it more likely for that user to understand what to do next, the intended behavior. So we can actually plot out these 3 factors of motivation, ability, and triggers on this graph that Fogg gives us that tells us that when the user has sufficient motivation and sufficient ability, they cross that blue line, and if a trigger is present, the behavior will occur. Now think about how powerful this is for any human behavior. Think about every time you want to get a user interacting with your product to do a specific behavior and they just won't do it and you can't figure out why. Well, all you have to do is plot them on this graph. Do they have high enough motivation? Is the behavior easy enough to do? And if not, what's in their way? And is a clear trigger present? So for any human behavior, we have to have all 3 elements at the same time. That's a very brief overview of the action phase. There's a lot more to be said about the action phase in my book, and you can look at that more. I give exercises for how to make the experience easier as well, and that's of course a basic element of well-designed products. let's talk about the reward phase of the hook, the fourth step of the hook cycle. When we talk about rewards, we have to start in the brain, and in particular an area of the brain called the nucleus accumbens, which was first studied by two Canadian researchers by the name of Olds and Milner. And Olds and Milner discovered that when they implanted lab animals with an electrode in their brain, into this part of the brain, they found that the lab animals would incessantly activate this part of the brain. They wanted nothing but to stimulate this nucleus accumbens. They would forgo food and water. They would run across painful electrified grids just to continue to stimulate this part of the brain. In later experiments on people, they discovered very similar results. That in fact, people would stimulate this part of the brain hundreds of times. Many of them had to have these machines forcibly removed from them to get them to stop activating this part of the brain. It was something that they did time and time and time again. But it turns out you don't actually need electrodes to activate this part of the brain. Your nucleus accumbens is activated all the time. When we see things like luxury goods that we might want, sex, certain chemicals, junk food, and of course right there in the center, technology, all activate this very same part of the brain, the nucleus accumbens. Now, Olds and Milner and much of the psychology community believe that the purpose of the nucleus accumbens was to stimulate pleasure. But it turns out that's not exactly true. That in fact, the nucleus accumbens becomes active in anticipation of a reward, and the way it gets us to act is by creating the stress of desire, wanting, craving. It's this reflex of desire that is the purpose of the nucleus accumbens. Because it turns out this part of the brain becomes most active before we get a reward, but when we actually get the thing we want, the thing that's supposed to make us happy, that's when this part of the brain becomes less active. And so it turns out that the way the brain gets us to act is by activating this itch that we seek to scratch. And it turns out that there is a way to supercharge this stress of desire. Does anybody want to know how? Is anybody curious? Well, that's because I'm doing it to you right now. So it turns out that the unknown is fascinating. And a bit of variability causes us to increase focus and engagement. This, of course, comes from the classic work of B.F. Skinner, the father of operant conditioning. He took these little pigeons, put them in a box, he gave them a disc to peck at, and every time they pecked at the disc, at first, they would get a reward. They would get a little food pellet. So peck at the disc, get a food pellet. But then Skinner did something different. He introduced a variable reward. So sometimes the pigeons would peck at the disc and nothing would happen. The next time the pigeon would peck at the disc, they would receive a reward. And what Skinner observed was that the rate of response, the number of times the pigeons pecked at the disc, increased when the reward was given on a variable basis. And so we now know, why does this happen? Well, this happens because variability spikes activity in the nucleus accumbens. It creates this wanting, this craving reflex that drives us to action. And so in all sorts of products that you find most habit-forming, most engaging, the ones that capture our attention and don't let go, you will find one or more of these variable reward types. Rewards of the tribe, rewards of the hunt, and rewards of the self. Rewards of the tribe are things that feel good, that have an element of variability, and come from other people. The search for empathetic joy, feeling good because someone else feels good, partnership, cooperation, competition, all examples of variable rewards of the hunt. Online, social media is a perfect example of variable rewards of the tribe, where on social media, on a site like Facebook, when I log into Facebook, I'm never quite sure what I'm going to see. What pictures did people post? What do the comments say? How many likes did something get? High degree of variability associated with a site like Facebook. Next is the rewards of the hunt, the search for resources, which stems from our primal search for food and other resources. And of course, in modern society, these things are bought with money. So when we play a gambling machine, a slot machine, for example, any kind of gambling game, there's this variability about what the prize is going to be. But we see the same exact mechanism online when it comes to the feed. Think about why the feed is so popular today. Why do so many products today have this feed mechanism? Well, think about it for a minute. When I check my Twitter feed, my timeline, the first thing's not that interesting, maybe the second thing's not that interesting, but oh, the third or fourth thing might be very interesting. And so this mechanism of scrolling through your timeline is very similar to pulling on the handle of a slot machine, both variable rewards of the hunt. Finally is a search for self-achievement, rewards of the self. Rewards of the self stem from our from things that feel good, that have an element of variability, but don't come from other people and aren't about these material or information rewards. These are things that feel good in and of themselves. The search for mastery, completion, competency, control, all examples of rewards of the self. So getting to the next level, the next accomplishment in a game, for example, feels good and has an element of variability, even if we're not playing it with other people. And if you say to yourself, well, you know what, I don't really play games, that's not really for me, I bet you play this game every day. Checking your email inbox to clear those messages, or finishing the things on your to-do list, or checking an app just because you've got that little notification telling you that something's waiting for you, all examples of rewards of the self, the search for competency, consistency, and control. Because the purpose of the variable reward phase, let's remember here, is to give the user what they want, to scratch their itch, and yet leave them wanting more. A bit of mystery associated with what they might find the next time they engage with the product. Which brings me to the last step of the hook, the investment phase. The investment phase is where the user puts something into the product for a future benefit. It's not about immediate gratification. This is about a future reward. And the purpose of the investment phase is to increase the likelihood of the next pass through the hook. And it does this in two ways. The first is by loading the next trigger. So products that can load the next trigger with a small investment increase the likelihood of the user returning. So for example, on WhatsApp, when someone sends a message on WhatsApp, there's no immediate reward. You get no points, there's no badges, nothing really happens when you send that message. What does happen, however, is that when you send someone a message, you load the next trigger because you're likely to get one of these. You'll get this invitation asking you to come back to use the app again. And that, of course, is an external trigger. The next way that investments increase the likelihood of the next pass through the hook is by storing value. Storing value is a very powerful principle, and it's why habit-forming products should get better with use. The more we use them, the more valuable they should become. So for example, when I store content on iTunes, it becomes better with use as my one and only music library. The more data I have that I give to a personal finance software like Mint.com, the better it becomes with time. I can do more with the product the more data I give a product like Mint or even Pinterest, for example. So if you logged into my Pinterest account, because it's been customized with my data, it actually wouldn't be that interesting to you. Followers. Followers is a way that a product can store value, because the more followers I have, the better the product becomes the way for me to reach my audience. So if Twitter were tomorrow to send out an email that says, I'm sorry, we're shutting down Twitter unless you start paying us, who would be more likely to pay? Would it be someone with 10 followers or 10,000 followers? Of course, it's going to be the person with 10,000 followers. The product becomes more valuable the more followers someone has. And finally, reputation. Reputation is a form of stored value that users can literally take to the bank, because your reputation on sites like eBay or Airbnb or TaskRabbit dictates what you can charge for your goods and services. And how likely am I to leave one of these platforms after I've stored all this value? Pretty hard to do, kind of unlikely. So that's it. That's a very quick overview of the hook model, these 4 basic steps, these experiences designed to connect your user's problem to your solution with enough frequency to form a habit. And through successive cycles through these hooks, this is how user preferences are shaped and how habits take hold. So that was a lot of information. There's a lot more in my book. It's a 250-page book full of actionable steps that you can take to build a habit-forming product. But if you want the summary, the 5 most important questions to ask yourself if you're building a habit-forming product are these 5 questions. Number 1, what's the internal trigger? What's the itch that your product is addressing? Number 2, what's the external trigger that gets the user to use the product? Number 3, what's the simplest behavior done in anticipation of a reward? Number 4, is the reward fulfilling and yet leaves the user wanting more? And then number 5, what's the bit of work done to increase the likelihood of the user returning through the next pass? With that, there's one more thing I'd like to talk about, and that is, of course, the morality of manipulation. Because we have a very special responsibility here whenever we are using the psychology of behavior design to get people to do the things we want them to do. Let's face it, my friends, that is a form of manipulation. And so we have to be very careful about how we use these principles, because the technologies that we're working on, these are the kind of things that we take to bed with us every night. These are the products that users reach for in the morning before they even say hello to their loved ones. And as Ian Bogo said, our technologies are quite possibly becoming the cigarettes of this century. So we have to be very careful about how we use the psychology of habit design and how we use it for good. Because as product designers and engineers and entrepreneurs and innovators, we have the ability to touch more people and to change more people's behavior than we ever have before. And so what I encourage you to do with this information is to pick one of the world's problems to fix. Is to engage people in something meaningful and something important, and to use the psychology of habit design to help people live happier, healthier, more productive, more connected lives. And to borrow from the words of Gandhi, I encourage you to build the change you wish to see in the world. Thank you very much.